Hi, I'm Jonah. And this is a Learn to Play tutorial for Alleluia. And this is a traditional hymn that so many of us know, and it sounds beautiful on the flute. Now, I think of this as kind of a late beginner, early intermediate level song, just because it has some fingerings that if you're just learning to play, you might not have worked with before. But it's a pretty straightforward song, so even if you're just learning and you want to learn the song, it just may take you a little more time to work through teaching your fingers the dexterity. I encourage you to give it a go. Now I'm playing this on a Spirit Flute in the key of G, is the first version that I do, and then at the end I do it on a Spirit Flute in the key of bass D, and it sounds beautiful. It sounds beautiful in both those keys, and I've also played it on higher tone flutes, and it's really sweet there too. So no matter what flute you have, I think it'll sound really sweet. So I'll play through the song once, and then I'll give a little introduction on how to use the tutorial, and then I'll go through the tutorial itself, and then at the end I'll play another version on the other flute. Now, the easiest way that I find to learn songs is to work through them phrase by phrase. Now, phrases are like sentences. You put a bunch of sentences together to build a story. In the same way, you put a bunch of phrases together to build a song. Essentially, each time you pause to take a breath, you've completed a phrase. And because in the music we've added these breath marks, you can easily see that the phrases begin and end at each of these breath marks. I've also noted the number of the phrases using these italicized numbers. Phrase 1, 2, and so on. As I walk through each phrase, I'll note anything that's unusual or particularly challenging in that phrase, and then I'll show you how to play it, and I'll play it at a really slow tempo. And at that point, I suggest pausing the video and working on that phrase until you have the fingerings and the rhythm pretty well down at that slow tempo, and then move on to the next phrase. Once you move through the whole song, I suggest going back to the beginning of the song and working through each phrase again. And each time you do that, your hands will memorize the fingerings a little bit more, and you'll memorize the rhythms a little bit more, and the song will get easier to play, and you can start bringing it up to tempo. These are the notes that some of you may not have played before, so when you come to these notes in the song, have some patience with yourself. It may take a little time to learn the transitions from the note before it to this note and to the note after it. I'll also talk more about these transitions and notes as we come upon them in each phrase. This is phrase 1 of Alleluia, and the first thing I want to look at is the rhythm. Now, the rhythm is pretty straightforward. There's no offbeat rhythms, meaning you're not starting anything on the offbeat or holding anything on the offbeat, and this is true throughout the whole song. And so the rhythm throughout the whole song is pretty straightforward in that way. Everything is on beat and it's all pretty consistent. And if you notice this 2/8 notes, quarter note, half note combination, this is a combination we'll see throughout the whole song. And it's not a complicated rhythm, it's just helpful to notice that this rhythm is coming up over and over and over again. Now we look at the notation. Most of the notes in this phrase are pretty straightforward. They're notes that come from the pentatonic minor scale, so they're notes that we've all played before when we were first learning to play the Native American flute, so that your fingers will have the dexterity to catch them. However, there's this note here, which might be new for some of you. And it's a cross fingering going from this note to this note, and then again from this note to this note. So if you haven't played with this note before, take some time to teach your finger the dexterity of the cross fingering. First, go back and forth between these two notes a bunch, just without even playing, just moving your fingers back and forth between these two fingering patterns. And then once your fingers are catching it pretty fluidly, then start just playing between them. Da, 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 back and forth, back and forth. And then once you have that, then do that same thing again for this note to this note. And then once you have that, then play these three notes in a row, and then start adding it into the phrase itself. And if you watch my tutorials, you'll know that I suggest that method a lot. And so it's just a really helpful way to teach your fingers how to start doing cross fingerings, how to raise one finger while lowering another at the same time. And this is the second phrase, and again the rhythm is pretty straightforward, as it is throughout the whole song. Now in the notation, this note might be new for some of you, and it shows up 1, 2, 3 times. And again, it's the same note that we saw in the first phrase, and it actually comes off of the same notes and goes to the same notes. So the cross fingerings are the same as well. So you practice these cross fingerings in the first phrase, and so they should be coming a little smoother for you here. Something I wanted to share with you is that I placed the breath marks into the sheet music. And so I chose to put the breath mark here at the end of phrase 2 where it is. And that's because for me, the melody feels like in phrase 2, it's walking its way downwards to a pausing place. And this half note here feels like a pausing place. And this half note here, at the beginning of phrase 3, feels like a beginning place. And that breath mark really helps delineate that. When you pause to take a breath, it creates this pausing feel that then when you move into phrase 3, creates a beginning feel again. So that's how I chose to put the breath marks in and why I chose to put it here. And if you find as you're playing the melody you want to shift where that is in order to create a different feel, that's your creative license. And I encourage you to do so. I encourage you to experiment with different ways to put melodies together that may feel more true to your ear and to your body as you feel the music. This is phrase 3, and in phrase 3 you're coming off of the downward feel of phrase 2, and you have this long section of half notes where you're holding these notes for a long time, and so it has this real pull downwards to a pausing point. And again, that's why I think this breath mark works really good here, is it creates this pause, and then you start on this half note again, which is still on that lower area, but it jumps up to this higher note here. And so it has this feeling of creating a new section of the song. Now in the notation, there's this note here that might be new for some of you. And if it is, take a little time to teach your fingers the muscle memory of the cross fingering going from this note to this note, and then from this note to this note. This is phrase 4, and in the rhythm, the beginning half has that same combination of notes that I've been talking about, and then it's a little different in the second half, but it's all pretty straightforward. Now in the notation, this note here may be new for some of you, And it's the same note we just saw in phrase 3. And coming off of this note, that's the same combination that we saw in phrase 3 as well. And then going from this note to this note is not a cross fingering, so it tends to be a little more straightforward to catch when you're just lowering fingers down. Now, the one thing that I noticed as I was learning this song is that as I moved through this section, going from here to here to here to here, as I moved into this note, my fingers tended to want to play this note. And that's just because I just moved off of that note. So it's something to pay attention to as you're moving through this phrase. This is phrase 5, and essentially what I created phrase 5 to break up phrase 4 from being too long, because it's a really long phrase otherwise to play on one breath. And this felt like the right place to put the breath mark in order to break that phrase up into 2. And what phrase 4 into phrase 5 is doing is it's starting to create again another kind of a pausing feel in the song. And in phrase 5, as we move into this whole note that we hold for 4 beats, that whole note really creates that feeling of a pausing place. And in the notation in phrase 5, it's really straightforward. It's just these 2 different notes that you're playing. This is phrase 6, and the rhythm in phrase 6 is pretty straightforward, but what I found is that it's a long phrase, and I needed to take a deep breath at this breath mark in order to make it through the whole phrase. Now in the notation, there's this note here and this note here that might be new for some of you. We've already seen these notes earlier in the music, in the song, and so you've already worked with it quite a bit, so your fingers are probably gaining the dexterity and the muscle memory to catch these notes, but it's worth mentioning that here they are again. And there's this note here, which is likely a new note for most of you. And so you're coming off of this note, which is likely a new note for a lot of you, and it's a large cross fingering jumping down to this note. So take some time to teach your hands the muscle memory of going from this note to this note. And once your hands are getting the dexterity and moving back and forth through those notes fluidly, start to integrate them into the end of this phrase. So just be aware that the last part of this phrase is not that straightforward, and it might take a little time to teach your fingers how to run through these notes. This is phrase 7, and phrase 7 is starting to end the song, and you see it in the rhythm. You have the 2/8 notes here, but then we move into 4 half notes, so it's really starting to slow down. Now in the notation, we have this note, which was just introduced in phrase 6, and is likely a new note for a lot of you. And then we have this note, which we haven't seen in this song yet, and is probably a new note for a lot of you as well. So pay attention to that one. And then we jump from that note back down to that, again, the new note that we just saw for the first time in phrase 6. So there's a lot of new notes here. So you just take a little time to teach your fingers the dexterity of jumping between them. And here we are at phrase 8 to end the song. And it's a very simple rhythm, 4 quarter notes to a whole note. And then the notation, these are new notes, but we just worked with them in phrase 7, so they should be coming to your hands pretty easily in this phrase. And the phrase essentially just moves along from phrase 7 and holding that same note, and it really creates this feeling of like, boom, finality, just really emphasizing that low note, and then you end on a high note, which a lot of songs don't do, so it's kind of unusual to have that. But it really works here to move upwards and end on this high note.